Hello, everyone. Welcome to this launch of the NORRAG Special Issue number 10, Education for Societal Transformation, Alternatives for a Just Future. My name is Chanung Baek, and I am the Academic Director of NORRAG and an Assistant Professor of Comparative and International Education at the Geneva Graduate Institute. I am very excited to welcome all of you to this important event. This special issue explores how education can drive societal transformation, offering alternative visions and strategies for creating a more just and equitable future. Today's webinar will follow this program. I will first hand the floor over to Rezan and Michael, two of the 8 guest editors of this special issue, for their introduction. And their presentation will be followed by 8 presentations from contributors to NSI 10. Afterward, we will have a Q&A session and a discussion with the authors. To give you a brief introduction of NORRAG, at NORRAG, we plan and organize our strategic activities to enable our stakeholders to first know what robust evidence exists. Second, amplify knowledge that is context relevant. Third, access underrepresented knowledge relevant to their work. And finally, act, meaning that they work with context-relevant knowledge and expertise to formulate priorities and solutions. Reflecting our strategy to co-produce, surface, and broker critical and particularly underrepresented knowledge in international education and training, NORRAG Special Issue, NSI in short, was launched with the ambition to be an open source periodical giving prominence to authors from various countries with diverse perspectives. And each issue focuses on the current debates that frame global education policy and international cooperation in education. At NORRAG, we critically examine and engage with the following thematic focuses that you will see on this slide. Data and evidence, education and the SDGs, innovations and disruptions, private sector approaches, and our network. Among these thematic focuses, this particular issue of NSI falls under the innovations and disruptions theme. I now invite you to explore our work and become part of our network if you're not already a member. Please scan this QR code right here to join our network map. I will pause for a few seconds for you to be able to scan the code. Now, I would like to introduce Rezan and Michael. Born in Istanbul, Turkey, Rezan is a sociologist concentrating on social change. She is an active member of the Alternatives Project, TAP in short. Michael is a scholar in residence at American University, teaching courses in international education, systems thinking, and social transformation. He is a founding member of TAP. Please, Rezan and Michael, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Chanwong. Hello, and a warm greetings to each and every one of you. And thank you for joining us. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you are situated on this very precious planet of ours. On behalf of our entire editorial team, it gives us immense pleasure to introduce NSI 10, Education for Societal Transformation, Alternatives for a Just Future. Here, I would like to take a moment to acknowledge our editorial team and all our contributing authors who have enriched our volume. Our thanks also go to the NORRAG team that has seamlessly orchestrated this entire process. Thank you. In this brief introduction, my co-editor Michael and I would like to tease out some rather pivotal points that have shaped our vision and guided us in curating this special volume. First of all, I want to focus on the reasons that gave rise to this volume, the genesis or raison d'être, if you will. Well, we're all cognizant of the fact that our little planet is in a polycrisis. Socially, economically, politically, and of course, ethically. Earth's community of life is being threatened, and the current socio-political and economic status is not serving us well. Indeed, we are all feeling a sense of urgency in the face of major crisis. The socioeconomic gap is rapidly widening. Corporations have become delinked from community accountability. And as one of our co-authors argues, economic distributional imperialism and global minority rule have taken hold. Moreover, we seem to be headed for a climate catastrophe and a psychosocial malaise. In the field of education, the public knowledge commons has been co-opted for private interests and become commodified, and an epistemicide is increasingly visible. What is needed is a radical change to the present rather dismal landscape. What is needed is life-centric economics instead of profit-centric economics. A well-being economy that is redistributive and integrative. A human-centered approach against the corporate hegemony of neoliberal capitalism. What is needed is an epistemological renaissance that will cultivate diverse knowledge landscapes that are resilient and transformative, and a future that will embrace a new ecological civilization with the flourishing of the diversity of life. As the 2015 Declaration of Climate Change has stated, what is needed is one human family within the greater Earth community in a world of peace, justice, and sustainability. To that end, a group of us initiated lively discussions on alternative ways of being and engaging with the world, and soon realized that alternatives are possible and do exist. I will now turn to Michael, who will introduce the alternative project, TAP, and who we are. Michael?
Thank you very much, Rezan, and warm greetings to everyone. The Alternatives Project, known as TAP, is a diverse transnational collective of progressive academics, union members, civil society activists, and social movement leaders concerned with building a global collective critical voice oriented toward education for societal transformation. In our founding statement, we called for others to join in a collective effort to elevate this message and champion this approach. We said, the undersigned, believe that current social, economic, political, and educational arrangements reproduce relations of power that engineer profound inequities and will ultimately threaten life on the planet. We stand for alternative pedagogies and for just, regenerative education systems that will support the social transformations we need in order to create a richer, more equitable, and sustainable world. 500 colleagues around the world were inspired to sign our statement when it was published in 2019. We are researchers who have studied examples of transformative education, practitioners who have designed and led such efforts, and academics who train educators in these methodologies. One initial step we are taking to spread the word about these practices is to publish this initial collection of descriptions of them. A team of co-editors from TAP, whom Rezan and I represent, laid out the framework and solicited contributions to this volume from other progressive educators around the world. And NORRAG agreed to publish these in their special issue series as number 10. So Rezan, why did we develop this volume?
So Michael, in curating our volume, one of our foundational points was to make sure that these educational alternatives were not merely cosmetic or band-aid reforms that helped to placate the present crisis, but real alternatives that sought structural and systemic change. Hence, the use of the term non-reformist reform, a term coined by philosopher André Garce. Now, we were joyfully aware of the fact that alternatives do exist in the global South and in the global North. Not only did we want to acknowledge these alternatives, but we also wanted to share them with a broad-based readership so as to inject some hope into our current rather dismal landscape. We were excited about the concept of tapas. There are plenty of alternatives, and we're impatient to highlight them. These alternatives would provide means of meeting human needs and aspirations without trashing the earth and leaving half of humanity behind. As one of our authors, Ashish Kothari, argues, many of those already exist as grounded initiatives for meeting basic needs: direct democracy, gender justice, cultural diversity, and knowledge commons. And they and they intersect 5 spheres of life: political, economic, social, cultural, and ecological, basing themselves on ethics of solidarity, diversity, care, right and responsibilities, and interconnectedness with others. So, Michael, if you would kindly fill us in on the justices that have guided us.
There are 4 values that underlie this volume. Our vision is of an ecosystem of education programs that promote 4 types of justice that you see displayed on the screen. Social justice, providing knowledge, skills, and orientations to address racial, gender, ability, and other inequalities. Economic justice, promoting transformation of the economic system to satisfy human needs, shifting away from unregulated capitalism toward workplace democracy and a redistributive economy. Political justice, preparing people to orient themselves to and practice inclusive and participatory democracy, to reject authoritarianism and xenophobic nationalism, and to engage in global solidarity, international cooperation, and global intersectional grassroots movements. And finally, climate justice, by which we mean teaching human ecology and stewardship values and skills that help transform current arrangements to live regeneratively on a stable, sustainable planet and mitigate the climate crisis. Rezan, what other framing ideas and types of education are included in our collection?
Thank you, Michael. Well, this volume draws on the theoretical frameworks and practical experiences. The authors present a diversity of alternative approaches and non-reformist reforms, including anti-racist and anti-patriarchal education, climate and decolonial education, Indigenous education and knowledges, critical pedagogy, peace education, and of course, education for social justice. Another one of our contributors, Miriam Lang, brilliantly highlights the fact that what we are seeking are systemic alternatives that move beyond the modern colonial capitalist civilization, which, as we discussed, finds itself in a profound crisis today. If the crisis we are facing is systemic, multidimensional, and civilizational, the strategies we build and the alternatives we offer must go to the roots and also be multidimensional and reconnect realms that have been torn apart from each other to shape new spaces where interepistemic or even interontological dialogue is possible. Now, Michael is going to guide us through the different parts of our volume.
The chapters that we've assembled sorted into several thematic categories that you can see displayed on the screen. And they suggest the topography of new emphases in international and comparative education emerging in these critical times. Part 1 brings together authors who describe broader societal transformations that would move us toward a more just future. The subsequent parts describe living examples of transformative education across the lifespan, in school and out of school, addressing key issues and learning needs of our time. For example, Part 5, Learning, Unlearning from Decolonial and Indigenous Knowledges, corrects for the exclusion, erasures, and disconnections of Indigenous knowledges by the colonial and post-colonial hierarchy of knowledge that dominates current education discourse, policy, and practice. Part 6, Responding to the Climate Crisis, proposes new forms of regenerative education that help reset the current imbalance of human ecology values from extraction and human exceptionalism toward an all forms of life on a living planet orientation. Part 8, Amplifying Education for Liberation, regrounds human learning in the Freirean tradition of cultivating critical thinking, fostering pluralism and peaceful coexistence, and focusing on the goals of solidarity and community well-being. We hope that education activists, policymakers, researchers, practitioners, and other readers find this landscape inspiring and a basis for growing solidarity and collaboration as we work together to shift the norms of education around the world back toward the pursuit of a more just future.
This book is less about criticism of how things are and more about alternatives. It is an exercise in idealism rooted in reality, a hopeful glimpse at how things could be. It is our hope that we have curated a volume that is engaging and inspirational and that will open up dialogue. We believe that the contributions in NSI 10 move beyond our current civilization laden with crises, inequities, and injustices, and offer genuine alternatives and hope in a world where, as the Mexican Zapatistas have stated, many worlds fit. A notion that not only embraces cultural diversity, but also epistemic and ontological diversity. We thank you for your attention and invite you to join our conversation.
Thank you so much, Rezan and Michael, for your informative overview of NSI 10, as well as the discussion on tapas. Now we will present the video showcase of the 8 contributions, one from each part that Rezan and Michael just gave us an overview of. The first contribution is from Stephen Cleese. He is distinguished scholar, teacher, and professor of international education policy at the University of Maryland, who works on the political economy of education and development.
Hi, I'm Steve Cleese, an economist and professor of international education policy at the University of Maryland. I'm a co-founder of the Alternatives Project and one of the editors of this NORRAG Special Issue. My paper is in the first section, entitled Envisioning Societal Alternatives. Since I edited this section, I'm able to say a few words about the whole section. In addition to my paper, we invited papers from 4 very prominent international scholar activists whose work is at the forefront of promoting transformative societal alternatives. This section is not directly about education. Its premise is that for the educational alternatives in this volume, discussed in this volume, to flourish, for our world to get out of the multiple global crises we face, we desperately need system change. I do understand that some believe that the idea of system change is both vague and far-fetched. While system change is difficult to define and very difficult to enact, there are so many groups, organizations, and movements around the world working on exactly that, which this section previews. In my paper, I talk about some of the writing efforts and practices I have found most compelling. Contrary to Margaret Thatcher's Tina, there is no alternative to neoliberal capitalism or to capitalism, period. I'm a firm believer in David Bollier's tapas. There are plenty of alternatives. Let me mention two wonderful books. The 28 essays of the New Systems reader, Alternatives to a Failed Economy, explore a plethora of alternatives from the Nordic experience to economic democracy to eco-socialism. Pluriverse, a post-development dictionary, examines dozens of transformative initiatives, like the alter-globalization movement, Buen Vivir, the Commons, degrowth, ecofeminism, solidarity economies, and Ubuntu. These books describe concrete alternatives happening on the ground, being fostered by some amazing organizations that I only have time to mention. We All, the Wellbeing Economy Alliance, DEAL, the Donut Economics Action Lab, the Green Economy Coalition, the Global Tapestry of Alternatives, the Democracy Collaborative, Progressive International, Adelante, and of course the World Social Forum. Even within system, alternatives can be transformative. I talk of the potential of the democratizing work movement, the push towards universal basic income, and the fight against the privatization of public services. The Our Future is Public campaign explicitly recognizes the need to, and I quote, move away from the racial, patriarchal, and colonial practices of patterns of capitalism and towards socioeconomic justice, ecological sustainability, human rights, and public services. The multiple challenges our world faces are daunting, but I am an optimist. I have been fortunate to work in dozens of countries, and everywhere I found people who believed in the slogan of the World Social Forum, another world is possible, and who were struggling for it. Let me close with a quote from Arundhati Roy. Another world is not only possible, she is on her way. On a quiet day, I can hear her breathing. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Before we present the next contribution, I would like to remind all of you again that you can share your questions at any time during the webinar using the Q&A box. And we will invite the editors and authors to explore them in the Q&A session later. So I highly encourage you to share them in the Q&A box for the editors and the authors. The next contribution is from Gustavo Fishman. Gustavo is a professor of educational policy and comparative education and director of scholarly communications at Arizona State University.
Imagine a school in one of the most impoverished neighborhoods in Porto Alegre, Brazil. A few years ago, I was doing research in one of those schools. I was interviewing Julia, the principal of the school, while we were interrupted by a student, João, that was Black, 16 years old, very poor, and he was drunk, and he was at the door screaming that he wanted a second chance at the school. He created a lot of havoc, and all of a sudden, Julia, the janitor, the cook, teachers, the psychologists, they were all spending time with João. So after they resolved the situation with João, Julia returned, and I asked her, well, Julia, why are you spending so much time with Joan? And I was expecting the typical answer from educators, because I love all children, or I was selected by this community to educate all children. And surprisingly, Julia said, no, I hate Joan. And I was surprised, because that was the first time in my life that I heard an educator that openly admitted that hated one of the students. We continued a conversation. It was very clear that Julia didn't hate Joan. What she hated was the systemic failures that our schooling systems have, and that create situations like Joan. What matters here is that Julia's words were a lot less significant than her actions and the actions of all the people in that school. The actions that led to providing food to Joan, clean clothes, and more important, a second opportunity for Joan to get into schooling again. Instead of getting rid of the Joans in the neighborhood, Julia's schools welcomed them in the youth and adult education program. So this wasn't a unique case. I saw many, many, many other cases within the Citizen School project. That was a project organized following 4 basic principles around democratization of access, democratization of curriculum, democratization of governance, and very active political participation in the system. So there were a lot of structures that were created for the Citizenship School project to provide for better opportunities and for a different type of education. What I can tell you is it's very hard to summarize everything, but these were not schools, regular schools. These were fun schools, active schools, creative schools, open to debates, and extremely high quality schooling opportunities. This legacy of the Citizenship School, even though the project was ended by different political administrations 10, 15 years ago, the legacy is still alive, and you can see the traces on the thousands of schools all over the world that are doing participatory budgeting and addressing the issues of democratizing access, curriculum, governance, and participation. Thank you.
Thank you very much. The third contribution is from Ashok Dhanavath. He is a postgraduate Indigenous scholar from Telangana, currently working as a senior researcher for the National Campaign on Dalit Human Rights. This piece was co-written by Radhika Maruaha, who is a PhD student at UC San Diego, and Dr. Nisha Taprial, who is senior lecturer at the University of Newcastle, Australia.
Hi all, my name is Ashok Dhanavath. I'm a senior researcher at National Campaign on Dalit Human Rights. I'm excited to introduce our article titled Anti-Caste Activism in US Higher Education, Beyond a Politics of Recognition, which I co-authored with Radhika, a PhD student at UC San Diego, and Dr. Nisha, a senior lecturer at University of Newcastle, Australia. In recent years, the movement to recognize caste as a protected category in universities has gained a significant momentum across the US. In this context, our article explores the nuances of this struggle, focusing on the tensions and debates surrounding caste within a settler colonial North American academic context. Caste discrimination has existed in South Asia for thousands of years. It is a social hierarchical system which is assigned to an individual at birth. As Dr. Ambedkar predicted, caste would become a global problem in 1936 speech. This indeed became true as South Asian caste oppressor went abroad in search of better lives. They took the caste with them. While India guarantees affirmative action for caste oppressed Dalit, Adivasi, or Indigenous Baujan communities, US universities recognizing caste discrimination in higher education have yet to address the question of reparation. This is crucial to doing justice for caste oppressed students from South Asia. Recognizing caste problem is indeed a milestone in the anti-caste struggles in the North American context, but it alone will not resolve the distributive justice question for caste oppressed students. Unless North American universities recognize the diversity question for the caste oppressed students and communities, through the reparative justice, caste coloniality will persist in academia and beyond. In light of this, our papers suggest reparative justice for caste oppressed students. Without it, many students cannot even envision themselves in admitting in these top US or elsewhere universities due to their socio-economic backgrounds, which are historically oppressed based on their caste identity. In this regard, we hope to suggest in our paper to make a reparative justice instead of reproducing inequalities and epistemic violence on the caste oppressed students. And we hope NORRAG Education for Societal Transformation issue of this year will create a broader discussion about the caste problem in US higher education and other global universities spaces. Thank you.
Thank you very much. The fourth contribution is from Rebecca Tarlow. Rebecca is an associate professor at the Stanford University Graduate School of Education. Her research focuses on state-society relations, social movements, and Latin American education. The contribution was co-authored by Alessandro Mariano, National Coordination of the MST.
Hi, my name is Rebecca Tarlow, and I'm an associate professor at Stanford University. And I'm going to talk about a chapter I wrote for the NORRAG Special Issue with my colleague and friend, Alessandro Mariano, who's part of the National Coordination of the Brazilian Landless Workers Movement, or the MST. Our chapter is called Landless Workers, Constructing Educational Alternatives for Agrarian Reform, Agroecology, and Food Sovereignty. For those of you who don't know, the Landless Workers Movement, or the MST, is one of the largest social movements in the entire world. It's a movement of landless people who have decided to take the issue of poverty into their own hand by occupying large, unproductive land estates throughout Brazil and squatting on that land until the government agrees to buy up that land and redistribute it to landless families. Through this process of land occupation, the Landless Workers Movement, the MST, has been able to get land redistributed to more than 450,000 families, or 2 million people, who now have land in which they can work and create a sustainable living. Our book chapter is about the educational proposal that this social movement has developed. Initially, the Landless Workers Movement didn't know that they wanted to engage in education. They were a farmers' movement. They wanted land so they could farm. But very quickly, they realized that farming was not enough if they wanted to continue to have future generations of people, of children, of youth who stayed in rural areas. This is because teachers who were sent to their communities to teach would often have the preconception that urban life was better than rural life. So very early on in the movement, the Landless Workers Movement believed that they had to not only occupy land, they also had to occupy the public school system. What our book chapter does is it talks about the 40 years of educational proposals that the MST has developed since 1984, when they were founded, until today. It discusses how in the beginning, the MST was focused on literacy, drawing a lot on Freirean educational methods based on pedagogy of the oppressed, using things like generative themes and research and dialogue in order to help both adults and children in occupied encampments learn how to read. Eventually, the MST began to coordinate with other movements, and by the early 1990s, the MST had its own high schools that were training teachers in this alternative educational pedagogy. In the late 1990s, they got funding from UNESCO and other international organizations to develop a broad educational program called Education of the Countryside, which became institutionalized in the Ministry of Education as both a department and a series of programs. Key to this educational proposal is the notion that for young people to succeed in life, they don't need to go to urban areas to get a job, but rather they can be farmers, intellectuals, mathematicians, and folks that grow corn and fruits and other produce in the countryside. Over the past 10 years, the MSc has focused even more so on the idea of agroecology, or how they can support transitions to more sustainable farming systems, as we now know that agribusiness is one of the biggest contributors to climate crisis. Overall, what the past 40 years has shown is that social movements that have concrete ideas for the type of future world they want to build are also able to construct education systems that support the development and thinking of young people to build that future world. We hope you enjoy the chapter.
Thank you very much. I now see that there are many interesting questions and resources that have been shared in the Q&A box. Please continue to share them throughout the session. It is also great to see that some of the questions have been answered by the editors and authors. I'd like to note that even though they may have been already answered by the editors and authors, there are still opportunities for us to discuss them later in the Q&A session in greater depth. So the next contribution is from Silvia Espinal Mesa. She's a doctoral researcher in education at the University of Bristol. Silvia is a sociologist interested in critical perspectives for understanding education and social justice.
Hello, I am Silvia Espinal Mesa, Peruvian and doctoral researcher in education at the University of Bristol in the UK. I'm delighted to contribute to this NORRAG Special Issue focuses on education for societal transformation, alternatives for a just future. Well, social justice is part of my research agenda committed to the revalorization of indigenous knowledge from the voices of rural teachers in Peru. Rural teachers in Peru have been historically excluded from official channels due to post-colonial wounds associated with racism, poverty, and exclusion of their own knowledges. Throughout my paper, I am showing the potential of critical pedagogies for reappraising the indigenous knowledge from the voices of a group of teachers working in Cusco and Ayacucho in the southern highlands of Peru. These teachers are promoting Freudian concepts such as dialogue and critical conscientiousness to show their students the cultural meanings associated with their Quechua surnames. For example, meanings associated with guidance and strength are helpful to empower students to be proud of their indigenous roots and reflecting critically about their own heritage and history. As one teacher said, I give each student a mission based on their surnames and meanings, and they work together. So it is how to bring that cosmovision to put each one in their spirit. It's not monetary value. It's a spiritual value. It's emotion. These teachers are also engaging with their communities by including the voices of wise elders, in Quechua, Yachaks. These wise elders are teaching children about Quechua culture and their value for everyday life. Yachaks teaches students on how to cultivate the land, for example, while others give talks about festivities and important dates relevant to their community. This cultural information is key in building the communal calendar at the beginning of each year. These social justice practices are a way of resistance to neoliberal policies, which are focused on quality education and with a very weak conceptualization of social justice in education. So far from addressing historical exclusions in the country since the first years of 1990s, neoliberal policies in Peru are not interested in discussing key issues of post-colonial legacies such as racism and historical poverty. Being aware of this historical discrimination and huge inequalities in the country, these rural teachers are promoting alternative pedagogies for fighting against injustices in Peru, showing, for example, the power of dance, dialogue, and environmental care towards the revalorization of indigenous knowledge. In other words, this is the buen vivir. Buen vivir, which is not only material, but also spiritual. Finally, I want to take this opportunity to invite you to read this paper and hope you will remain committed to social justice in education by including the voices of marginalized populations to revalorize Indigenous knowledge. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. The next contribution is from Ahana Gangui. She is a chemistry and climate science professor in Azim Premji University, India. Her current research interests are in nanotoxicology and environmental chemistry.
Good afternoon. My name is Ahana Gangui, and I'm a chemistry and climate science professor in Azim Premji University in India. In this special issue, I've contributed a chapter titled A People's Pedagogy for Climate Action in the Indian Sundarbans, in the section on responding to the climate crisis. So the pedagogy project that I describe in my chapter basically started about 4 years ago in the aftermath of a devastating cyclone in the Indian Sundarbans. So the Sundarbans, for those of you who are not familiar with the region, basically has about 5 million inhabitants who are scattered across these low-lying island villages. And these low-lying island villages are protected by thousands of kilometers of embankments that keep out the surrounding seawater. So it is safe to assume that these inhabitants are extremely vulnerable to the impacts of climate change. The pedagogy project that I described in my chapter basically aimed to create youth climate action groups in collaboration with an agricultural workers union called the Paschim Banga Khet Madur Samiti. And these youth climate action groups were basically young people who we trained to act as community educators, as well as join a struggle to advocate and galvanize support for a more just and sustainable development of this extremely ecologically vulnerable region. One of the things that I would like to highlight about what I've described in this chapter that is important when we consider how to respond to the climate crisis in the future is that climate change may be a global phenomenon, but vulnerability is a very local and non-homogeneous experience. And so any effective pedagogy of climate change must merge global expert knowledge with local perception of risk and indigenous knowledge. And that is what we have effectively managed to do by using student-led independent research and inquiry as a foundation for our discussions and analysis. The second thing that we have managed to effectively do is never privilege the ecological concerns over the socioeconomic concerns of the youth that we're working with, and concerns over things such as livelihood, food, energy, transportation have always been front and center in our discussions. It has helped that our partner is a grassroots organization with deep roots in the region with a lot of experience in kind of making people understand class realities and the nature of systemic disenfranchisement. The last thing that I would like to say before I end is that as a university educator, from the point of view of my university classroom, when I first ventured out into the field as a community educator, my assumption was that if we manage to communicate science and social scientific issues better to the community, they will galvanize and catalyze action by themselves. But what I realized in the grassroots reality of the Sundarbans is that action and movement away from the business as usual is perhaps not easy, but it is extremely important that we move away from the business as usual paradigm rapidly and urgently and as fast as we can. Thank you.
Thank you very much. The seventh contribution is from Jumana Iwaili. She's a British Academy, a postdoctoral research fellow at Ulster University, and a co-founder of the Swana Forum for Social Justice at University College London.
Hi, I'm Joanna Alwaili. I'm going to discuss briefly my chapter, which is concerned with social just education for refugee children. When arriving into the resettlement context, refugee children are yet to embark on another journey of finding a sense of home, regaining a sense of home. To regain some sense of ordinary life, refugee children need to first find safety, which starts with the legal safety of having the right to remain in the resettlement context, and then extends to building new relationships with those around them in order to find some sense of belonging. What pursues is the will to succeed in their new social environments. The very first place where refugee children are able to be introduced to their new social environment is school. In school, they need to find this safety, which extends beyond safe spaces to emotional safety, and build relationships of belonging, and then find a will to learn and succeed. However, these pillars do not exist in a vacuum. They need conditions of acceptance rather than rejection to prosper and flourish. If those children were not recognized as human beings, if they were just given this label of being a refugee without any recognition of their skills, their knowledge, their capital, if they were not offered the resources enough to address their needs, and if they were not given the platform where they can have their voices shared, listened to, and acted upon, then finding safety, building new relationships, finding a will to learn will not happen. This is when Nancy Fraser's conceptualization of social justice as parity of participation is very useful. Placing Colley's resumption of ordinariness within the moral normative framework of Nancy Fraser is imperative. However, when doing this research with a group of Syrian refugee children in a school in London, they also substantiated another condition of social justice in order for them to feel safe, to belong, and to learn. This condition was love. They asked for more love from their teachers. It wasn't a one-off act of compassion or love from teachers. It wasn't the love that they need to find in their familial circles, and it is certainly not the romanticized version of love. It's love that Freire terms as critical love, that looks larger and sees deeper beyond the classroom. It is a form of transformative, sustainable, inspiring, respectful love that I would call, following many scholars, pedagogical love. This is the relational pillar of social justice that I suggest adding to Nancy Fraser's theory. Relational justice as pedagogical love is a sustainable enactment of good teaching and pedagogy, and an ethical disposition that underpins the work of teachers in schools. It is characterized with care, respect, trust, commitment, accountability in everyday practices within the classroom and in school. It involves working together with leaders, teachers, students, in order to foster safe environments within the classroom and in school. After that, belonging and success can pursue. To know more, please read my chapter, Pedagogical Love, the Relational Pillar of Social Justice. Thank you.
Thank you very much. The last contribution is from Paul Hendricks. He is a history of education lecturer at the University of Witwatersrand in South Africa. He is a former school teacher and cultural practitioner from Cape Town.
Good afternoon from Johannesburg, South Africa. I'm Paul Hendricks. My presentation speaks to the political and educational history and activism of the educational fellowships in South Africa, a radical debating, discussion, and cultural formation that was linked to the left-oriented non-European unity movement established in 1943 in South Africa. The unity movement presented an alternative ideological outlook to the African National Congress and the Communist Party of South Africa at the time, and continued to do so. Many of the education fellowship adherents, its teachers, unionists, and activists, as well as students, remained politically active well into the post-apartheid period, organizing against the growing racial, gender, and class inequalities in education and society. Focusing on the education fellowship's ideas and innovative organizational practices thus makes it a relevant entity or current to explore and study in the current period. Although the fellowships were not large mass-based formations, their ideas had an influence well beyond their membership numbers. The fellowships would pursue in Gramscian terms a war of position that endeavored to nurture an alternate counter-consciousness to the dominant one of the apartheid ideologues. These educational forums sought to nurture a cadre who would not only subvert the apartheid system, but also contribute to the construction of an alternative democratic society. The Education Fellowships founded in the 1950s took their lead from the left-wing New Era Fellowship, which had its origins in Cape Town in the late 1930s. The forerunner of the 1950s fellowships were the Cape Flats Education Fellowship, CAFEF, and the South Peninsula Education Fellowship, SPEF, formed in 1951 and 54 respectively, in the Western Cape. Fellowships were also established in other parts of the country with mostly the same aim. Similarly minded teachers and activists were central to the educational fellowships and directed their efforts into these community-based structures, since they were viewed by the apartheid regime as educational, not political bodies. This allowed the fellowships to avoid falling foul of the Suppression of Communism Act, which would result in members being banned or arrested. To counter the ideology of apartheid education, which aimed to limit the oppressed students to vocational training for a white supremacist state, the fellowships offered discussions on diverse topics, from philosophy to social issues that included the land question, the social value of music, mathematics and philosophy, and more. The Alternative Educational Project had at its core the ideas of non-racialism, non-collaboration, and anti-imperialism. During the repressive years of the 1960s, following the Sharpeville massacre, the banning of political organizations and individuals, the political spaces shut down in the country. The fellowships, however, continued to become arenas where pupils and teachers, among others, were to be politicized and develop their intellectual horizons. Youth were exposed to alternative politics and activities to broaden their worldview, to see themselves as part of a much broader community, where world and local literature, film, and politics came under the spotlight, and where the dialectic of the local and the global became the norm for regular participants. The effect of these interventions was that by the 1970s, when the repressive machinery of the state had silenced virtually all political opposition in the country, the fellowships still held forth and continued to operate. When the countrywide student revolts of 1976 erupted, fellowship members viewed it as the outcome of work they had been doing for almost 2 decades in schools and in the broader communities. The radical influence of fellowships would further be advanced when the 1980 school boycotts saw students forge links with the rising workers' movement. Having reached their high point by about 1979, the fellowships lost their luster as the 1980s progressed. By then, other avenues within the liberation movement had opened, with many fellowship activists continuing to their ideological work in a range of local, civic, political, and educational structures that were not necessarily unity movement oriented. In these structures, former members of the fellowships maintained the critique of the socio-economic system and sought to continue to cultivate an alternative perspective to the mainstream market-oriented one. This form of resistance these activists carried out well into the post-1994 period, as South Africa introduced neoliberal policies that sharpened inequalities, particularly in education. Teachers who had worked within the fellowships thus continued to argue that in a new South Africa, all children deserve quality education. These teachers and activists were involved in the parent-teacher-student associations, the independent unions such as the National Union of Public Servants and Allied Workers, where they would continue the mission of the fellowships. The mission would persist into the COVID-19 pandemic period, when organizations such as NUPSO and education activists formed the Progressive Organizations Formation to support under-resourced, socio-economically poor schools. As the educational fellowships had viewed themselves as anti-imperialist and part of the international solidarity movement, they studied and championed struggles for justice across the world. As internationalists, their former adherents continue to support the struggles in Palestine, Sudan, Lebanon, among other struggles worldwide. The history of the educational fellowships offer valuable insights into how progressive grassroots formations can sustain themselves over long periods of time while organizing and mobilizing for an alternative, more just and equitable education system and society. Thank you.
All right. So I shall be very brief. Thank you, Chan Wong. Now, a conceptual archaeology of the many chapters in this volume clearly reveal a valiant and urgent call for a more equitable, just, and sustainable world. Injustice everywhere is a threat to justice everywhere, as Martin Luther King has said, and peace cannot exist where justice is not served. So we have to keep working, we have to keep struggling, and always keep our face turned towards the sun, as the Walt Whitman poet states. Thank you all very much.
Thank you so much for all of your presentations and thoughts. Now I would like to welcome all authors and editors for Q&A. Please turn your cameras on so that the audience can see your faces. Also, I'd like to remind all editors and authors of NSI 10 that you are welcome to write your replies to the questions in the Q&A box during the event. And in this Q&A session, I will try to ask questions that could be relevant for the majority of you. That said, there are definitely some chapter-specific questions shared in the Q&A box, and I strongly urge those authors to reply to the Q&A box because we may not be able to address all of them during the live session. And I also encourage all the audience to connect with the authors and the contributors even after this event to continue this engaging conversation on this very important topic. That said, I would like to start with a broad question that was shared in the Q&A box, which is, can you please explain in more detail what is meant by non-reformist reforms? Because I think that was quite at the core of this entire volume. And perhaps for the individual chapter contributors, if you can talk about this in relation to your specific chapter, that would be helpful. Is there anyone who would like to go first?
Well, thank you, Chan Wong, because that is a pivotal question. And I believe maybe Steve might want to address that. I tried as best I could to indicate the fact that what we meant by non-reformist reforms was a systemic reform that was not just a band-aid solution to placate a crisis momentarily, but was much deeper and aimed at transformational and systemic work. So maybe Steve might want to piggyback on that.
Yes, Steve,
Go
and
ahead.
then Frank.
Go ahead,
Right?
Steve.
Oh, non-reformist reform was an idea promulgated long ago by Andre Gors, and it's trying to get at what Rezan said, reforms that are not merely what he called reformist, ones that don't challenge the system, the status quo. But what is a non-reformist reform is in the eye of the beholder. It's very hard to say what is really challenging systemically and structurally the world in which we live. And so it's a judgment call. And it is something that will be revealed by the future more than anything else. Is this sustainable? Does it challenge existing inequalities, discrimination, patriarchy, racism, capitalism? So it's an aspiration to look for reforms that are fundamentally trying to change the system in which we live.
Yes, Frank.
Sure, thanks. Hi, everybody. So, in writing my response in the Q&A, I realized exactly what Steve said. It is in the eye of the beholder. So for me, reform, saying the word reform, everybody claims it, but not few actually do it. And so, and the co-option of the term is rife across education. We're all doing reform when in fact, a lot of folks are reproducing inequity. So there's that lens of how do we measure, as Steve said, and then I want to also turn to my chapter, which is writing about our climate emergency. We simply are on the clock for a very dire situation, and we don't have time to tinker at the edges. So we are caught in just the rest of the Q&A. There's a good deal of how do we do these projects at the institutional level and the systemic level. I want to return to the genesis of my involvement in this group, which was Steve leaned over to me in 2016 and he said, we need a global grassroots movement. And we've expanded that to a global grassroots intersectional movement. And that this is part of that movement, right? We have to build and acknowledge what's going on the ground, which is often light years ahead of what's institutionalized, and surface what we're doing in real time. And even reading the chat box here, I'm looking at 10 to 15 links of things around the world I didn't know about that we all need to connect on. So, I mean, this is an emergent process even in this webinar. And how do we capitalize on that? And then how do we use people who are on this webinar who hold positions of institutional power, who know that we need to change things and are working within that? What do they need from us? And hopefully it's more organization and more works like this that bring together all of these collaborative designs. And I'll say one final thing is, the question is like, what is the system that's going to happen? Well, there are plenty of alternatives, as Steve would say. There are many things that we need to do collectively, and we need to think really hard about how to bring them up into some kind of unified collective global action at the institutional level. But right now, we're still trying to figure out what does work in a non-reformist way.
Thank you. Are there any additional thoughts that any of the authors and editors would like to share regarding this? Yes, Radhika.
I think this question on reform, non-reform is interesting, especially from our article where we talk about caste abolition as our end goal that we're pushing towards, that we try to inculcate in our work, especially when we are thinking about caste in North American universities as a context, right? And we know from the work of Black and Indigenous scholars that North American universities are settler plantation institutions. These are land grab spaces that use the language of DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion, to on paper, give us what we need, but do very little to change the material realities of Black and Indigenous, caste oppressed students, and other marginalized groups. And so that is what we are pushing towards. And in knowing that we can do some type of reform right now, we've talked about how a lot of North American universities over the last 5 years have made caste a protected category in their anti-discrimination policies, so that marginalized students can turn to that and say that they are facing caste discrimination that needs to be addressed. But so much of the systemic material inequity, lack of scholarship support, lack of peer support, mental health support, or even competency that these universities have to address, these types of historical structural harms that they've allowed to go unchecked. There is no infrastructure to make that happen. And a lot of the times it's community groups that end up doing the work that DI professionals, get huge sums of money to do. And so, we've been also playing around with that idea of reform and how far it can take us, and how much we need to be engaged in the idea of caste abolition, like the abolition of caste as the structure, but also thinking about what the university as this totalizing structure of knowledge means to us.
Thank you. Steve?
I would just want to add that I highly recommend you read our Envisioning Societal Alternatives 5 chapters. They're really people who are struggling at the forefront of developing alternatives society-wide, within which our education alternatives have to flourish. So tremendous 4 authors in that section.
Thank you. I think the big question that we are exploring in this special issue is closely related to the question of how, right? And how can we make changes or bring changes and so on. And I think that's a good segue to our next question, and I think some of the answers have started to already touch this question already, but there is this one question about, when creating alternative space for societal or systematic transformation, to what extent should these spaces keep talking to systems still in place? And I think this is an important question. Perhaps we can explore a bit further with all of you. And if you can draw once again on your specific chapters, that would be wonderful. Ashok, please. Ashok, please go ahead.
Yeah, no, nothing. I think it was a technical error. Sorry. Yeah,
Okay, I
Chan,
see.
you go ahead. Yes, sir.
Yes. Is there anyone else who would like to answer the question? Yes, Rachel. Oh, I don't see Rachel, but Rebecca, please go ahead.
Well, I don't think one can answer this question, but it is the question that social movements have dealt with throughout history, right? Do you try to engage power and build alternatives within the structures that implicate you within the current systems, or do you reject all of those systems and attempt to create alternatives outside of the capitalist state? And I think I think social movements have responded to this question differently, and sometimes they enter the state and they get co-opted, and then sometimes I think there's lots of examples, like in the case of the Brazilian landless workers movement, where social movements have been able to use the capitalist school system in order to prefigure socialist alternatives within it and all the contradictions that entails. I think it often depends on the type of state. The example I often give is the Zapatistas, right? The Zapatistas in Mexico have completely rejected the Mexican state, and partially the strategy of the Mexican state for this past century has been the constant co-optation of community organizations and social movements. So of course, an indigenous movement that's fighting for sovereignty is going to reject working with the state. But I am a big opinion that there's not one right answer to this question, and that social movements have to make strategic decisions based on their particular state context and the current conjuncture that they're in.
Thank you. I saw Rachel's hand earlier, so Rachel and then Giuseppe and then Gustavo and then Steve. Rachel, I'm not sure. Oh, yes, please go ahead.
Hi, sorry, I can't seem to get my video to turn on, but I just wanted to respond as well to the question about working from within existing structures and you know, what is the right balance. And I agree with what Rebecca was saying. It's really a difficult, it really depends on the context in terms of figuring that out. But I am a teacher in a local school here in Vermont. So I'm certainly working within the system. My chapter is about some of the experiences that educators went through during the pandemic and the alternatives that emerged during that time, and really drawing on a lot of the innovation that was taking place. So the strategy that I've tried to employ and with my colleagues coming out of this action research project is certainly to apply the pressure from within, but making sure that we continue to work with other organizations outside of the education system to put that pressure through school board meetings and other community forums to make sure that there's some recognition that these alternatives aren't just coming from one place within our community. So forming those types of community connections and partnerships, I think, is the key to all of the organizing that we're doing on the ground here. So thank you for organizing this. It's very exciting to see everybody.
Thank you. Giuseppe?
Thank you very much. It's so great to be here and to be listening, and also have the possibility to give some answers. Although I want to repeat what also Becky was saying before, that there cannot be a total answer to this question, in the sense that, of course, some elements even of analysis necessarily depend on the positionality on the person that is doing the analysis, in the sense that even co-optation, we can define co-optation as a term, but we can also, you can assess it differently for different groups or different even personal histories. While looking at reality, I think that something that is absolutely fundamental to leave there is no alternative framework is understanding that ideologies still exist, are still relevant. There is no post-ideological world. It has been an illusion, and it has, of course, had an effect on culture and also even on organizing. But it is an idea that derives from a clear hegemonic situation that has been developed in the last decades. And now probably, even if we are doing this book, probably it's also because it's not going really well. So looking at counter-hegemony does not mean necessarily going totally far from reality or going to utopia. Or, well, there are also people saying utopia has to be considered and to be used to change reality. But I want to remember that, for example, and I mention again Gramsci, the idea of alternative that he was envisioning, of course, in his times with his categories, don't need necessarily to be repeated in the same way today. But the idea is that theory has to come somehow from practice. So it is not possible to envision a world that is alternative if you don't start somehow from what you have. That does not mean that you have to be a reformist or a non-reformist, because some things that today are labeled as reforms wouldn't have been considered reforms probably a few decades earlier. I mean, especially in the European context, on this I have a big European bias, and again, neoliberal hegemony is quite powerful in that. So I think that it's important to try to understand what is being counter-hegemonic and how you want to be counter-hegemonic, which goals in the short term, in the longer term, and knowing that the dialogue with already existing structures and even sometimes with the elements of the social reproduction in which we are entangled is something to consider or even to exploit for good goals. But yeah, there is no answer. It's important, I think, to keep open and to dismantle as much as possible the barriers that we get from the current hegemony that is absolutely limiting our way of envisioning alternatives, of imagining something different, but in the real world, in our streets, in our cities, in our schools.
Thank you. Steve, and then Sylvia.
Yes, hi. You may notice I changed my background. I was at the beach, but now we're at the World Bank. We had a discussion in class the other day, last night actually, on the role of the World Bank in education. And to answer the broad question is situational. And it's a question of perspective, of working within systems, working outside systems. In the particular case of the World Bank, as the agent of international development, there was a 50 years is enough campaign to shut down the World Bank and the IMF, not an inside reform. And that is going on right now. There's a, led by Jubilee South, it's called Stop the World Bank and the IMF. It's 80 years is enough. And it's saying we can't do internal reform in the bank sufficient to change the structures in which we live. So it's situational and it depends on the era. But I think the World Bank campaign is a very interesting one that should be watched closely. Thank you.
Thank you. Sylvia?
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, it's again, so it's difficult to provide a final answer, but I think building on the main points that the previous speakers were building, definitely can speak from the experience in Peru. And yes, I mean, it's like these teachers are in rural towns in Peru are promoting these values to revalorize, to reappraise, for example, indigenous knowledge, to work with students to build these strategies. But of course, so they are not the majority of teachers in Peru, but they are also promoting or trying to make resistance, and it's a way to revalorize these pedagogies, which historically have been silenced by neoliberal policies. I think it's interesting to for us as authors to raise this point, so to show the power of these actors historically silenced the different indigenous movements in Brazil, in Peru, Ecuador, in the global south, in South Africa. So they are fighting against these structures. Of course, this is not, it's particularly, complex. It depends on each context, definitely. It's situational, as Professor Cleese just mentioned. And I think in the case of Peru, it's even probably more complex because of diversity. It's part of one of our main features or characteristics in Peru. But at the same time, poses difficult challenges. But these kind of chapters are also trying to promote or trying to be optimistic in a way to say very clear that it's possible to do this, even, within the structures of these states or neoliberal states. And yes, that's it.
Thank you. Before we go to Michael's answer, I'd like to draw your attention, authors and the editors, to the Q&A box. There are still very interesting and meaningful questions that are shared, which we will not be able to address fully in the live session. So I strongly encourage you to check them out and start writing some written comments in response to them, so that because there are some chapter specific questions, but I rather for us to engage in a more broad questions so that everyone could chime in and share their perspective in relation to your chapter. So please pay attention to the Q&A box as well. Michael, please go ahead. Please unmute.
Yeah, thank you. Two beautiful examples from the specific chapters. One from Brazil through Becky, and the presentation about the movement building in South Africa that started early in the 20th century and kept evolving through the turmoil of the apartheid struggle and then the post-apartheid nation-building effort, are good examples of one of my favorite kinds of subversive education, and that is political education and specific training in how to be a change agent, how to understand one's positionality as inside or outside, as being a person with a very modest sphere of influence versus someone who has gained political power and therefore has a wider sphere of influence, who one's allies are, how to combine forces between insiders proposing change and outsiders agitating for change. These tactics, combined with political education that were exemplified in the landless movement and its understanding of the role of education as an ongoing source of power, and in the South Africa movement as an evolving capacity to civically engage when different new challenges for democracy building were arising, is a very potent form of non-formal education that even can be included in civics education in school. We help children co-govern a school, learn to mediate disputes, learn to manage bullying, learn to coordinate honor codes and maintenance and accountability of them. We're beginning to train each generation to actively participate in navigating landscapes where change is needed. And this is where places like the Highlander Folk School in Tennessee, which was the training center for the civil rights movement in the US, or the Coady Institute in Newfoundland, or the Sarvodaya movement in Sri Lanka. All of these are grassroots, community-based, non-formal education programs where this tactical training in how to be a change agent in your family, in your neighborhood, in your community, then as an elected district council member, then as an MP, then as a labor minister. All of these are domains in which practicing change to find the tipping point, to shift the big norms of the assumptions of society in the direction of just participatory democracy can be explored and constantly iterated by allies across a much wider landscape. This is sort of our vision of what we hope to work with many others to mobilize the social movements on this scale.
Thank you, Michael. Steve? Please unmute.
I just wanted to follow Michael briefly and just say that this book is not a one-off activity of the Alternatives Project. We've been active for the last 4 or 5 years, and we plan to go further. And in line with what Michael was saying, gathering people together who are interested in alternatives, in fundamental alternatives, non-reformist reforms. And we urge you to go to our website and contact us if you're interested in working with us further. This is a long-run project that we're all engaged in. So thank you very much. I'll let Chanwung do the thanks, but thank you, Chanwung, and thank everybody for attending.
Thank you. The event is not over yet. Rezan, just quick point, please. Please unmute.
Yes, a very quick point indeed, just piggybacking on what Steve just stated. The book is an invitation for dialogue. The book is an invitation for sharing. It is not an end-all, but it is a way of opening up new horizons, new windows, and new possibilities for dialogue, for exchange, for brainstorming, for changing, hopefully, towards a better world.
Oh.
Thank you.
Didn't mean to interrupt, I apologize. But indeed, as echoing what has been said before, it's the start of the conversation and start of the engagement. And with that said, I would like to thank all the authors and contributors. And Camille, could you please share the screen? Yes. So based on the presentations and discussions we have had today, I am very excited to announce that NSI 10 is now officially available on our website. You can read and download it using this QR code. I will pause for 3 seconds for you to be able to scan the code. And once again, this publication is available on NORRAG's website. So even if you didn't have a chance to scan this QR code, you can access NORRAG's webpage at any time, and you will be able to read and download the publication. Once again, thank you to the guest editors, authors, participants, and the organizing team at NORRAG for your time and participation. Thank you.